Hi everyone, welcome to my inaugural YouTube video essay. I've got a lot of thoughts, and now you're going to hear about them. Because I'm new to this, I wanted to start off with a kind of pre-baked video. This is adapted from a panel I hosted for an anime convention last fall in the before times, so it puts all the onus on production because research, writing, and getting media collateral was already done. As a panel, this one is kind of a free-ranging video talking about the Shonen Big Three of the 2000s, Bleach, Naruto, and One Piece. There isn't a central theme, just me going through my take on the philosophy behind evil and very different backgrounds each of these villains come up with. So without further ado, here we go with Sosuke Aizen. And the theme of this section is ennui, and I had to look that one up for pronunciation. Ennui being one of those words that you read about but never really hear spoken. We'll start off with a quote. "Boredom is the root of all evil. It is very curious that boredom, which itself has such a calm and sedate nature, can have such a capacity to initiate motion. The effect that boredom brings about is absolutely magical, but this effect is not one of attraction, but of repulsion." So why do we all hate Aizen? And no, it's not just for stabbing Momo. Aizen gets a lot of heat for being the overly perfect villain, and his perfection doesn't do the plot of Bleach any favors. Some villains become all-consuming black holes, with all of the plot threads circling the event horizon, inevitably to be sucked in. To me, a lot of Bleach felt like there was really cool stuff going on just at the fringes of the story we were being told, which helped make the world seem richer to its benefit, but then you never really got the payoff for that, although they presented interesting ideas. So Aizen is the plot black hole, as it were, sucking in everything fascinating and leaving what you saw in that first video. Aizen and his henchmen are a microcosm of that. Many of the Espada have good thematic strengths. Tozen and Ichimaru are both studies in the futility of revenge and what a waste it can be to get back at people as your sole motivation. Hell, the Rancor and Vizards themselves explore the tension and the opportunities that come from breaking down barriers, how they can be more powerful than those who are pure, but at the same time breed conflict by straddling different worlds, different identities. They're compelling themes, but they're all swept aside by Aizen's all-consuming might. It's a bit of history for those who may not remember Aizen's background. He himself is much simpler than his Machiavellian machinations let on. His goal is to be perfect, and to evolve himself into a more perfect villain, assuming the throne of godhood via the Soul King. But this perfection goes back to the beginning. His ex-captain Shinji noticed a special talent and a certain menace in him. In the Turn Back the Pendulum arc, exploring the past, he aces the best of the best with no real effort. He continues to do this again and again, even unto the final fight to the point where the Hogyoku betrays him. And it's speculated that the Hogyoku betrayed him because what he truly desired was a challenge. And so ennui was his driving force for two reasons, both stemming from the fact that he was too perfect, too powerful. First, in that he was going for the highest possible station because he saw no other reasonable use of his power, and second, because deep down, he craved a challenge. So why godhood? A good point towards this philosophy in the text is much earlier than Aizen's defeat, back when Kurotsuchi fights Zayo in the initial Rescue Orihime arc, where Kurotsuchi, mad scientist par excellence, laments how terrible perfection would be.
Perfection is a dead end, a condition of hopelessness.
Aizen pursues godhood because he can, because without the drive to reach for the very top, he has no purpose in a world that does not challenge him. However, at the same time, he works to provide that challenge. His great reveal as a mastermind comes gradually in revelations to Ichigo that he has orchestrated everything in Ichigo's life as a means to make the protagonist stronger, to give him a challenge. Per him, this challenge was to enhance the power of his fusion with the Hogyoku, to force rapid evolution through combat danger, kind of like Dragon Ball Z. However, subconsciously, he also raised Ichigo up because he wanted someone not just to challenge him, but to beat him. This is the reason that the Hogyoku abandons him after Ichigo damages him enough for Uraharu's final spell to take root. It had served Aizen's ultimate purpose in driving him to a point where he was finally lesser than someone, finally beaten by them. And so for Aizen, you can see that sort of lifelong existential crisis. We're going to go back to that original quote for a minute. Boredom is the root of all evil. It is very curious that boredom, which itself has such a calm and sedate nature, can have such a capacity to initiate motion. The effect that boredom brings about is absolutely magical, but this effect is not one of attraction, but of repulsion. And this is from the existentialist philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard, let's stop and look at this guy for a second. He even looks like Aizen, right? But he was one of the first existentialists, one of the first to really question the purpose of human life beyond a specific moral or spiritual religious calling. In the essay that he wrote about boredom, he talks about the rotation method, which everyone knows is how you don't get pregnant when you're Catholic. It's based on crop rotation, and is the idea that you need to do different things with yourself to keep from getting bored. Though he says that in the end everything becomes boring, so that despair is really the only option. And in that way, doesn't he kind of seem like an anime villain himself? Or a magical girl? Either way. Up next, we have Naruto and Pain. So we start with this guy Nagato, or Cold Steel the Hedgehog, or Pain. Yeah, Pain. He's basically the condensed version of shonen villainy, at least the ones who aren't upfront one-note dicks like Frieza. Really, even beyond shonen, so many villains boil down to the world was mean to me, so I'll be mean to the world. Pain is interesting since he's conscious of this trope, trying to find a way to break the cycle of pain. Pain is the second Naruto villain to provide a dark mirror to the hero. Gaara starts off by showing Naruto if he had been completely unloved and had no bonds with others, while Pain is Naruto if he strayed from his moral compass, from his belief in the power of those bonds to heal and allow people to grow. Namely, Pain is a realist to Naruto's idealist. Realism is an interesting philosophy because you more typically see it in action. Thomas Hobbes, not pictured here, famously called life nasty, brutish, and short. He said a bunch of other stuff about human nature and the best way to rule people, but those 4 words cover it pretty good. Realism's the political equivalent of Biff coming up to you and saying, "Hello, anybody home? Think, McFly, think." So it relies on assumptions that often go unquestioned because of how tough things can be out there. The world is self-apparently bad, and the realist reaction to that is thus very alluring to a lot of people. What makes Pain interesting is that he takes that surface-level realism, which is present in a lot of other Naruto villains, and tries to apply an idealistic spin on it. The world is crappy and doomed to violence and the cycle of hatred, but Pain thinks, hey, we can lean into this crappiness, try to create a system of balance. His plan to teach the world pain is a twisted take on what's usually a very heroic trait of empathy. Empathy allows you to feel the pain or frustrations of others and helps you to grow closer to their thoughts and feelings by sharing their pain, their joy, what have you. The ability to empathize is part and parcel to caring, or to being anything further up on the morality scale than an anti-hero. In teaching the world pain, instead of emotionally sharing another's pain, you would literally share another's pain, and he would do that by using the tailed beasts. With the 9 tailed beasts, each one of the major villages could get one, and create a system that was somewhat balanced, although Pain had too dim a view of humanity to believe that mad, and more on that in a minute, could last. But that he could temper the endless cycle of war by raising the stakes of the wars so high that the usage of the tailed beasts would shock other nations into not fighting, so that wars would be brief, if massively destructive all at once. That way the pain would be shared, literally, as everyone would have the same experiences from war, both rich and poor, soldier, civilian. Because of the massive destructive power of the tailed beasts, there would be no separation, either between nations or classes or anything. Everybody's life sucks equally. Pain is especially interesting in that regard because he's the only one who acknowledges the international relations or geopolitics of the Naruto world and the role it has to play in driving the plot. while Naruto himself goes deeper, looking past countries on a map to see people he could unite through his philosophy. Pain's realism took a more surface-level view. Growing up in the Hidden Rain village in the center of the map of the Naruto world, he faced the problem that buffer states have faced in the real world in history, a nation ravaged by war simply because other nations need to pass through to get to their real enemies. Like Belgium in the two world wars, or how Iran long suffered at the nexus between the British and Russian spheres of influence. Buffer states like this can never become strong because it's not in the interest of the stronger countries to let them become strong. But it's also not in the interest of buffer states to not become too weak because then they aren't a buffer anymore, and the dueling powers now have to stare one another down directly. You can see this today with the continued existence of North Korea, kept by the Chinese on the brink of starvation and collapse, but never allowed to tip over that brink unless a strongly US-allied Republic of Korea suddenly parks itself right up on the Yalu River. That reality is what contributes to the ongoing suffering of the North Korean people, just like it did for the people of the Village of the Rain. And Pain's also interesting in the exploration of Cold War doctrine. MAD is pretty generally known in pop culture, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction as an effective nuclear deterrent. Simply, don't use nukes because there will be no one left to enjoy any victory if you do. Pain's outline for the world didn't see that as happening and assumed periodic wars would be the norm, and this takes a peek at the lesser-known side of Cold War strategy, MAD's aptly named sibling, NUTS, standing for Nuclear Utilization Target Selection. NUTS followed the idea that a limited use of nukes in war was possible, and that careful use of tactical nukes on relevant military targets would be a way to end wars quickly, instead of leading to an extinction event. Thankfully, nobody's ever been nuts enough to try. And now for one of the biggest and best of the Naruto-verse, Madara Uchiha. The quickest comparison to Madara is Aizen, at least as far as their role in the plot. Both ridiculously overpowered to the point where they rendered large slots of the caste obsolete and required the hand of authorized God to bring them down. Both schemers to an absurdly exacting degree, having a hand in so much of what happened throughout their stories. Kind of fitting because both Aizen and Madara desired to be gods, to stand utterly above everyone else. Although unlike Aizen, Madara had a very well-developed reason for doing what he was doing. Really, his reason was too well-developed, but we'll get to that in a minute. Madara also fits in with Pain in that he was trying to resolve what he saw as the fundamental flaws of the world. Pain looked to resolve the military-political problem of war, but Madara saw the problem as going deeper than that. He had worked with Hashirama back in the day to establish the ninja village system to try to end the more brutal and unorganized clan wars that came before it. But then he said submitting to political authority just traded one kind of conflict for another. Madara had a fundamental issue of framing everything in terms of winning and losing, and to him, losing was suffering. The story treats this frame of mind with nuance, because Madara lost things where losing absolutely was suffering, such as the death of his brother, but also things where it wasn't, like persistently being second fiddle to Hashirama socially and politically. He lumps all of this losing into a single category and deems it all to be equally bad, part of the human condition. What Madara spoke to, and one of the real root themes in Naruto, was the duality of man. Here we're going to take a quick trip back to Psych 101 and Carl Gustav Jung. Jung's belief was that there were two sides to the human psyche, the ego and the shadow. The ego was the self that we wanted to acknowledge, the one that was socially acceptable and did things to positively relate with other people. The shadow is all the parts of yourself that you suppress, either actively or passively. But just because they are not the revealed parts of yourself doesn't mean that they aren't there. Jung said every good quality has its bad side, and nothing that is good can come into the world without directly producing a corresponding evil. This is a painful fact. This was the basic contradiction that Madara found lying at the root of all the bad things that he found in the world, and Naruto, and here I mean the story and the character, spend their whole arc trying to fight and unravel this contradiction. Naruto is always about bringing that darkness out into the light, reconciling it, fist-bumping with it, the whole nine yards. The kind of Takno Jutsu therapy that Naruto provides throughout its run is a process that Jung called individuation. Individuation is the process of reconciliation between the conscious and the subconscious, the ego and the shadow. It's not easy, of course. It's painful work to deal with difficult things, with the bad parts of your past and your present, but it's necessary work. Now, maybe if Jung had had the Rinnegan, he wouldn't have had to come up with such a painful process for this reconciliation. With the Rinnegan and the Gedo Mazo, the power of all the tailed beasts and the power of all the chakra in the world, you could come up with a system of infinite and all-consuming hypnosis to put people in a state where they would never have to confront any of their unconscious fears or unacknowledged desires, where everything is precisely as they want it or wish it, forever. Where Kishimoto maybe went a bit too far with Madara, beyond letting him make punks out of the 5 Kage, was that with Madara's philosophical viewpoint, you had gone about as far with the very concept of conflict as you can go. Once you've touched on the duality of man, you're playing down with the very atoms of conflict. You can't go any lower, and you can't really resolve the question, because that struggle is always going to be there, in all of us. And if your issue is with struggle itself, well, then the only thing you can do is have an alien woman come down from the moon, take over your body, and blow you up from the inside out. On that note, we're going to start off the One Piece section with a twofer, Arlong and Hody Jones. One Piece is as much an adventure anime as it is a shonen battle series. Indeed, the battle aspect of it's become less rote as time's gone on, fewer of the one-on-one fights that anime fans really love, and more free-flowing action set pieces. But what stays consistent is that each villain in the series presents an ideological counterpoint to Luffy, usually through a specific different value they have rather than a whole coherent ideology, though really it's a mix. And we're going to go through a quick list of them with 3 focus villains highlighted. And this is note to self for future video essay material because there is a lot of just neat stuff going on with this. First, you have Buggy, who views piracy as kind of bullying instead of freedom and adventure. Kuro, who's a real coward. Krieg, who's disloyal to his crew. Arlong, who deals with kind of reverse racism and the cycle of vengeance. Wapol, who's disloyal to his subjects. Crocodile, who's another realist and deals kind of with the death of dreams. Enel and his god complex. Foxy, who had no belief in the power of the bonds between his crew. Rob Lucci, who represented state-sanctioned brutality. Gecko Moria, who was about confronting fear of death and fear of loss. Hody Jones, and unfounded bigotry and fascism. Don Quixote Doflamingo and totalitarianism. And Big Mom as an abusive parent. Not going to touch on Kaido for the moment, given that the arc is still ongoing, but there's something in that about power for its own sake, or power over all other sakes, and what you sacrifice to get that. Anyway, going back to the Fishmen. The Fishmen are the first sign that all is not sunny in the One Piece world. Well, the first sign is the corrupt and brutal Captain Morgan of the Marines, but he's portrayed as something like a rogue, the exception and not the rule in their government. # not all Marines. Arlong starts off like the normal villains who came before, big, strong, pointlessly mean and cruel, but he pitches his meanness as founded in a hatred of humans, a hatred that he claims is deserved. The manga doesn't really touch on whether this is right or wrong, though he's portrayed as utterly in the wrong otherwise, whatever his excuses. Then it sleeps. For years and years and hundreds of chapters, until Hachi, one of his subordinates, shows back up at the Shabadi Archipelago arc, along with the young mermaid, and we see the slave-trading racism of the world nobles, the celestial dragons, and the humans who work for them. Really, it's a mixture of racism and classism. The celestial dragons treat everybody, despite their race, beneath them with roughly the same level of contempt. But the dragons being human makes it easier for the humans to align with them and to enslave the other races. Fishmen and merfolk in particular were valuable because they were rare on the surface of the ocean. And so Arlong himself comes off as kind of a refugee from Naruto. It comes full circle that Arlong was a victim of this racism. Not as directly or as severely as many fishmen, because Arlong himself wasn't a slave, but he fought alongside the liberator Fisher Tiger, who was a former slave, and while fighting alongside him against the celestial dragons and the marines who support them, he sees the worst that humanity has to offer. He had an upbringing of anti-human racism in the poor fishman district of the Underwater Kingdom. but what he saw in life only confirmed his beliefs. When he went out to terrorize the East Blue, where he exploited Nami and fought against Luffy and crew, he went there with plenty of evidence and justification to back up his hatred. This didn't make him right, again, but morphed him from being a standard jerk-ass villain into being a more Naruto-type cycle of vengeance kind of villain, evil because he had seen evil and product of a hard world. The real world is awash with these kinds of complex anti-villains, victims of oppression who turn oppressive and cruel themselves, well-known terrorist groups like the Irish Republican Army or Hamas. They evoke no sympathy, and nor should they, but you can at least see where their darkness may have emerged. Hody Jones, however, puts a different spin on this. He had the same upbringing as Arlong in the impoverished Fishman district, but he never went abroad, never had a chance to see human cruelty firsthand. But the same hatred of humans festered in him, apparently for no reason. Not having any humans in the Fishman society to vent that hatred upon, however, although there were traveling pirates that he later enslaved as revenge for his people, and to build up his armies like ground forces to feed into a meat grinder, he turned that hatred on his own people. He fought for a radical revision of the Fishman merfolk society, to align them and militarize them against humankind. And the first step to that end was having to purge the fishmen and merfolk who opposed his vision of their society, starting with his secret assassination of the peacemaking Queen Otohime. Years later, he attempted his push right when the Straw Hats showed up, just in time to be thwarted. His views and methods match fascism pretty closely, and not the hyperbolic fascism that many people toss around, Godwin's Law style, but the real mechanisms of fascism. If you're here watching a video essay, you're probably familiar with Umberto Eco by now, but just to run through it for those who might not know. Eco was a political scientist who grew up in Mussolini's Italy and who categorized the common traits of fascism, which often expresses contradictory ideals, and you can kind of see that in the most famous example, the nonsensical label of National Socialism that the Nazis applied to themselves. But there was a distilled essence which defined fascism, and Jones matches a few of the points that Eco brings up. 1. Disagreement is treason. He painted all fishmen who wanted to coexist with humans as traitors, starting with his assassination of the Queen. 2. Fear of difference. Easy, provoking anti-human sentiment. 3. Appeal to social frustration. He found popularity in the slums of the Fishman district, where the poor took up his message of hatred, not against the wealthy and the ruling class, but against an external scapegoat. 4. Pacifism is for the weak, again with his hatred of Otohime and the other pro-peace elements. 5. Cult of action and heroism. He invoked the memory of Fisher Tiger as a rallying cry, and built his movement around his pirate crew to promote an air of lawlessness and kind of raw justice, of the kind of warrior thuggery that fascist movements will favor. One of the most poignant moments in the One Piece manga comes from Hody Jones and kind of slides under the radar like the whole Fishman Island arc, as it were. One of the princes of the realm confronts him angrily, asking him, "What happened to you to drive you to this? What in the world did humans do to you?" To which Hody Jones replies, quite simply, "Nothing." And this is an important thing to learn about bigotry and hate. It can come from a material source, a grudge that's either ancient or recent, a product of some sort of exploitative system or prior conflict, but something that happened in the past to breed ill will. However, it can and often does take on a life of its own as it's passed down through the generations. As the original cause of the hate is forgotten, it lives its own life. And just as there are many in this world who hate because of ongoing conflict and oppression, there are many who hate simply because they were taught to, and yet that hatred is just as powerful and destructive. Last of all, we have Don Quixote Doflamingo. Like a lot of the seven warlords in One Piece, Doflamingo is introduced and alluded to long before the arc in which he's fought. In this case, we see his influence all the way back in Skypiea with his subordinate Bellamy. All of the arc-leading villains in One Piece represent an ideological hurdle for Luffy, and for the crew, but few of them are set up to be actual parallels for Luffy himself. Really, there are only three who fit that mold: Crocodile from Alabasta, Blackbeard, the potential final villain of the series, and Don Quixote Doflamingo. This fabulous bastard was born into a life of unfathomable privilege, being one of the celestial dragons who have unlimited power over the whole world government in One Piece. But while he was still a small child, his father decided to abdicate his position and go live among the commoners, taking his wife and 2 children with him. Once in the outside world, the elder Don Quixote learned that the commoners hated his kind. Doflamingo's mother got sick and died because she couldn't, as a commoner, get the kind of life-saving treatment that she could have gotten otherwise. Doflamingo later murders his father out of rage for everything that his father had taken away from him. His gentler-spirited brother also gets murdered, although much later and only after he betrayed Dofi's plan to achieve immortality. His story has everything psychologically: the tragic dead mother, patricide, fratricide, wanting an impossible dream of restoring a lost childhood. A tragic backstory fit for the Straw Hats, but he's much too sociopathic to be one of them. Where the other parallels to Luffy come in is that Doflamingo is recognized by the people around him as a unique talent, someone who's destined to be great, and the narrative goes along with this, giving him the 1 in a million power of Conqueror's Haki, the ability that lets you knock out weak-willed opponents with sheer willpower. He attracts a following of powerful men early on who resolve to help him achieve his dreams, but unlike Luffy, who wants to be the freest man on the sea, Doflamingo's aim is total control. Doflamingo's entire life was built around trying to restore by force and finesse what had been ripped away from him by his father. You could call it a lifelong temper tantrum, but he was ultimately more subtle and cruel than that. Indeed, he was known to have risen above flashes of anger for the most part, because he was consumed by hatred for everyone and everything. To that end, the kind of cruelty shown by other One Piece villains was not enough for him. He had to dig deeper, to dominate everyone in his orbit on a personal level, not just the people he knew personally, but everyone in his web. Doflamingo's methods for control resemble a lot of totalitarian dictatorships of the 20th century through the modern day. Totalitarianism differs from other kinds of dictatorships, while often the king or tyrant is content to leave their people alone as long as the people keep their heads down and mind their own business. The totalitarian is not content with that. The Italian fascists were among the first to espouse the idea, with Italian fascist theorist Giovanni Gentili, who defined it as everything within the state, nothing outside of the state, nothing against the state. Doflamingo was not content with people peacefully acquiescing to his rule. He reveled in the power of control, and employed that control both fantastically and psychologically. The fantastical method of control, still kind of similar to real-world techniques. Through one of his subordinates, a girl named Sugar, he had people of the island of Dressrosa turned into toys. Living and talking toys, but as toys they were absolutely subject to their owner, Sugar, and so Dofi by proxy. A side effect of being turned into a toy was that your old self, your humanity, was forgotten. This was a way of destabilizing and micro-controlling society similar to the kind of unpersoning tactics used by Stalin and others, or how different media franchises so frequently disappear without a trace from the Chinese internet. But his control was also built into his twisted understanding of the human psyche. Doflamingo, knowing only hate in his heart, only understood hate and anger from others, but he understood it very well and could manipulate even good-hearted people through their inner darkness, if only temporarily. Even Luffy is goaded by Doflamingo's abuse of his subordinates, or by Doflamingo auctioning off Ace's devil fruit as a prize in a tournament. He always had a plan, some little twist of the knife, to get people to dance on his strings, and in that way he could suppress what was not needed for his rule while promoting what was useful to him. On the poli-sci side, this runs into a phenomenon called preference falsification, where people believe that political figures, especially dictators and their regimes, are untouchable or unbeatably popular, when in reality a great part of the population is just putting on a front, because they believe that the regime is universally acclaimed and don't want to be the one nail that sticks up. With Doflamingo, as with real dictatorships, his power can be great and his control can be far-reaching, but it's ultimately a paper tiger. only as scary as people allow it to be. Just as the Straw Hats overthrew Doflamingo in the course of a day, one day in 104 episodes, total collapse can come faster than anyone can guess. Thank you all for watching my first video. Apologize for any audio weirdness, new to the setup and still tinkering around with the right audio setup, but will improve as we move forward. Please like, comment, subscribe if you'd like to see more of the same. I think next time I'm going to be attempting to make sense of the Star Wars sequel trilogy. And you can also follow me and my random thoughts and video game screenshot posting on Twitter @BelowLeft. Thanks again.